Thanks. Thank you, Mary, for that. And thank you for the lovely music. Wonderful to be with you. Whatever the reason, it's been a long time since the last time I was with you. I remember the first time that I was with Winston-Salem Friends was when my uncle was pastoring at the meeting. I won't go into much of that. But I worshiped with you in that house, in the new meeting house, and now here. How many of you go back to the meeting house downtown? Wow, I never got into that one, but thank you. But wonderful to be with you. What I want to share about today arises out of two experiences recently. The scripture passage I'm going to read from in a moment, Genesis 13, was assigned to me by Barclay Press in their Illuminate series. Do you use the Illuminate adult Bible study materials here or personally? It's a good series, and even in spite of the fact they sometimes ask me to contribute to it. And they asked me to do Genesis 13 for the upcoming series about Abram, later Abraham, as peacemaker. And I'll get into that in a moment. But the other experience arises out of a phone call Jane and I had 3 weeks ago with our congressional representative, whom most of you probably know, because she's yours too. And we had a conversation about some of our concerns about Israel-Palestine and the current situation there. And she begged to differ with us, specifically because of her interpretation of the chapter in Genesis preceding Genesis 13. Genesis 12 talks about how God has decided on who gets to live in certain real estate. And there are different interpretations of that we'll get into. But chapter 13, which comes right after chapter 12, has a bit different interpretation of things. And as I was getting into research into my contribution to the Illuminate series, I was fascinated by how different that interpretation in Genesis is from Genesis 12. Now, that phone conversation was brief because once it became apparent that we differed in our interpretation of chapter 12 of Genesis, she cut off the conversation. And we did extend it a little bit, but I did invite her to come today because I'm going to be interpreting what I wasn't able to share in that truncated phone call. I do not see her here. Maybe she's waiting to come for the potluck. But we will see if Virginia Fox shows up. I somehow doubt it. Anyway, let me read chapter 13, 1 through 9. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife Sarai, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. He journeyed on by stages from the Negev as far as Beth-el, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, to the place where he had made an altar at the first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them living together. For their possessions were so great that they could not live together. And there was strife between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right." Barclay Press sees that as evidence of Abram as a peacemaker. And I believe that the whole book of Genesis is laid out by the writers of that book as an alternative view of what many people interpret from chapter 12 as only one people get this land, and there is eternal strife between those people who live there. Now, I won't get into all the details of who wrote Genesis. I'll leave that up to Judith and David and Beulah, who studied this kind of stuff in divinity school. But they can regale you with J, E, P, D, all the various
J1, J2.
authors. And it's important to understand that, although we won't go into all those details here, because the Pentateuch was put to the 5 books of Moses, were put together carefully with very specific understandings of theology and what the writers wanted people to understand about the nature of God and how we were to live together. Early Quakers recognized that as well, long before they ever studied in a seminary, and in fact, long before they even allowed a seminary in 1960. And Margaret Fell, some of you have probably read her Women Speaking Justified, sees in the book of Genesis very clearly the reason why Quakers believe women speaking is justified, even though the Bible is often used by contemporary Christian groups to deny women the right to speak. She looks at how the Garden of Eden is described in the book of Genesis, how Adam and Eve were kicked out because of disobedience, and she, in her Women Speaking Justified, talks about how in the garden was harmony. Male and female were equal. God's nature was dual, male and female. God created them. And says the strife between male and female is a result of our disobedience and having been kicked out east of Eden. But early Quakers believed you could return to the garden. You have George Fox's great vision of going up through the flaming sword into the very state in which Adam was before the fall, entering into that state of perfection and harmony. That flaming sword being both kind of a symbol of alchemy at the time, but also of strictly out of the biblical narrative that an angel was placed at the entrance to the Garden of Eden with that flaming sword to keep Adam and Eve from getting back to the tree of life. Early Quakers understood that we can, through obedience to the inward light, to the Spirit of Christ, to God, enter back into that state of harmony in which male and female lived in harmony. So early Quakers had an understanding of how to read the book of Genesis that is not necessarily the way other people read it. Now, before he was Abraham, Abram was a wandering Aramaean, and there's an important aspect of that too that's incorporated into the book of Genesis. He was a pilgrim and a stranger in Canaan. And the experience of such people often make them especially sensitive to others who have a similar experience, others who are pilgrims and strangers. I think this is an important aspect to understand in the book of Genesis. And here's another excellent example from our own Quaker history. How many of you have heard of Anthony Benezet or Antoine Benezet? Yeah, you Guilford people. Anthony Benezet was born in 1713 to a Huguenot family in France. In 1715, an act of toleration was revoked, and the Catholic persecution of Protestants came full force. The Benezet family was well-to-do, but they handed over the last bit of their earthly wealth to border guards to get into Holland to escape with their lives as the persecution raged around them. Eventually winding up in England, the Benezet family, most of them appropriate to where we are now, became Moravians. But Anthony, for whatever reason, I think it's because we have better potlucks, became a Quaker and wound up in Philadelphia in the 1730s, where he established the first school for people of color in the American colonies. One of his students, Richard Allen, went on to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And Anthony Benezet went on to become a very influential author of texts about the evils of slavery at a time when Quakers were enslavers themselves. His writings, which were based on study of Native Africans in their native state and how they had a pretty decent life in Africa before they were enslaved and brought here and deprived of their liberty. And his writings had such a deep influence that the Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley, simply plagiarized his writings to convince English parliamentarians about the evils of slavery, leading to England's abolition of slavery in 1808 in England. He had a profound sense of others who were pilgrims and strangers in this land. And I think it's important to again recognize the importance of Abram's having been a pilgrim and a stranger and how that made him sensitive to some of these concerns. Now, as a sojourner in a strange land, Abram received the hospitality of the indigenous population. That, unfortunately, escapes many people who read these texts. He was welcomed by King Melchizedek, king of Salem, today's Jerusalem, and welcomed into that land. When his wife Sarai died, the Hittites in Hebron offered free burial plot. When we go with our service learning trips to Hebron, back before the area where the Hittites and Abram negotiated over that burial plot, you could get to the very gates of the ancient city where they sat and negotiated that. And from that very spot, you can see the Ibrahimi Mosque, where is the caves of Machpelah, where Sarah was buried. The Hittites offered a free burial plot to this stranger in their land. Abram said, "No, I'm a pilgrim and a stranger, let me buy it." But again, this is a very important aspect of how we understand how Genesis is being put together, how these characters are being described, that there isn't this eternal strife between people. There is this understanding of hospitality, this understanding of how to be a pilgrim and a stranger, how to respond to that. Now, Abram's response to Lot, after a period of enmity between their herdsmen, is consistent with this narrative and consistent with the understanding that we still see when we go to the West Bank, where there's still nomadic herds people who share the land with other herds people as their flocks of goats and sheep and other cattle roam pretty freely around. Think back to our own Native American history in the United States, or before the United States. There was no such thing as ownership of the land. People grazed their herds. And when they came into conflict with each other, because sheep eat that grass down to a nub. That's why on our dairy farm we had no sheep. those cows needed pasture and could not share it with sheep. People negotiate, okay, how do we share this land? How do we wander over these hills of Palestine with our sheep and our goats, sharing this common land? Abram and Lot, seeing the strife that was developing between their respective herdspeople, figured out a way. And that peacemaking continues on through the book of Genesis. And it's important to recognize that. Because again, I believe the writers of the Genesis had an intention here. You start with Abram, who becomes Abraham, and at his death, Isaac and Ishmael, who in the common narrative today are the progenitors of the Jews and the Arabs, Isaac and Ishmael, come together to bury their father. That's not often told in the story of enmity in the Middle East. The narrative we hear is this is an eternal conflict, goes back 4,000 years. There's no solution to it because Isaac and Ishmael are enemies. That's not the story of Genesis. They come together, reconcile, and bury their common father together. Next, you have the story of Rachel and Leah, or Rachel and Leah, who again, in common understanding, can't stand each other because one got gypped, and because what wasn't as good looking, didn't have good eyesight, and so there's this, something happened. And one was chosen, the other wasn't. And again, the common narrative is there's strife between Rachel and Leah. But in the Talmud, the Jewish sages say they reconciled. They came together. And in fact, then pulled some pretty fast ones over some of their husbands. And it's interesting, again, to see that that's not how we understand that conflict typically. We think there's this eternal strife. But no, again, in the Talmudic sages, Rachel and Leah reconcile. Then you get Jacob and Esau. There's a story, of course, of deception and intrigue. And in this wonderful story of how Jacob is preparing to engage Esau with his army and Esau's army, night before this engagement, Jacob has that dream. Now, we've been to the very spot where we've had that dream. We know because there's a sign that says it is. Just outside of Ramallah, Beth El. It's kind of like Zacchaeus' tree and Abraham's oak. We know those are the very ones because there's a sign that says they are. But he has this dream of the ladder. And, again, he's struck in his hip, has that limp, but he sees the face of God, which is supposed to kill you. The next day, Jacob, anticipating this bloody conflict with this mortal enemy of his who got gypped out of the birthright, he sees Esau running towards him, and his first thoughts are probably, I'm a goner. But Esau embraces him. They reconcile. And what is Jacob's expression when that happens? Is, when I look into your face, it's like looking into the face of God. From that dream the night before. And again, that is not the common narrative we take away from Genesis. But it's clearly there. The writers have an intention. And then you get to one of the final stories in the book of Genesis, yet Joseph and his, again, you seminarians will know it's a coat of long sleeves, but that doesn't make a very good Broadway play. Joseph and his amazing coat with long sleeves. It just doesn't have the same panache. He is sold into slavery by his brothers. And what happens with that story? He welcomes them to Egypt to save them from starvation. Genesis doesn't end and get on with the rest of the Bible until all these folk reconcile. It's a very important message, because the popular narrative about the enmity in Israel and Palestine is that it goes back in biblical times, 4,000 years ago. Our ambassador to Israel just last week said everything that's happening right now is justified biblically from text from 4,000 years ago. You got to wonder if he's actually read Genesis. He's a Baptist preacher, so you can forgive him. Well, Southern Baptist, American Baptist here. But anyway, that's the common narrative. This enmity between these people goes back 4,000 years. But an important example of the fact that that enmity that is capturing the headlines of our papers and our media these days with what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank, what has happened in the last many decades, really only goes back about 100 years to issues of in the 1800s, British colonialism, European colonialism, and geopolitics. Because if you take a look at what we have seen in the city of Hebron, in 1929, there was a large population of Jews living together with a large population of Muslims, Christians, Arabs, and Jews living together peacefully and in harmony. 1929. But in response to British immigration policies that was bringing many Europeans in, vying for real estate with the indigenous population, there was an uprising, and a mob of folk from Jerusalem went into Hebron and attacked the Jewish population, killing 67 Jews in a massacre that is still talked about by the settlers who now occupy 20% of Hebron. And that story continues to motivate the settlers who are taking over increasingly that city and the West Bank. But we don't hear the rest of that story. That was a mob from outside. The indigenous Palestinian population protected hundreds of their Jewish neighbors. And in one famous story that I'm always hesitant to talk about in mixed crowd, a mob had gathered at the door of one of the Muslim families who were protecting their Jewish neighbors, demanding that they send them out. And they said, no, we will not send them out to their death. But they kept beating on the doors. And so the woman of the house, a conservative Muslim woman, went up onto the rooftop. And the rooftops there are flat, so you can do this without falling off, and exposed her breasts to the mob, which in that culture embarrassed the mob. And they dispersed, saving their Jewish guests. That story isn't told by those who have a dog in this fight to maintain this story of constant enmity. Just like these narratives of Genesis about reconciliation are typically not told. I want to end by sharing one other example that is very personal to us. Jane was just there in April visiting the farm of the Nasser family who owned their land from Ottoman times. They were among the few sheep herders who actually registered their land with the Ottomans rather than just grazing public lands, which is because you had to pay tax to the Ottomans if you registered your land. They are now in an area of the West Bank surrounded by 5 settlements that want their 100 acres of land. They have been attacked repeatedly, physically and legally. They've had 25,000 of their grapevines burned, destroyed, or the crop simply stolen. Last summer when we were there, 2 weeks before we arrived, settlers came in and just stole all of their grapes, and it wasn't even harvest time, just to destroy their crop. They've had thousands of their fruit trees, apricots, figs, olives, burned, destroyed, or bulldozed. They have demolition orders on every structure above ground, including fences and cisterns. All their utilities have been cut off. The road to their farm has been cut off. They have no direct access to their markets or to their church. They're Lutherans. But at the entrance to their farm is a stone in several languages that say, "We refuse to be enemies." And when we ask them, how can you persist with that understanding when you've been attacked consistently, when the state, the military occupation, doesn't recognize your right to own and live on that land? How do you do that? And they said, it's what Jesus told us. We're just following what Jesus told us. That's integrity. And I think living with integrity, which is a major testimony for friends, means to take seriously how these stories are integrated into the Bible, integrated into the book of Genesis, and should be integrated into our own lives. And as we close and go to our next hymn and the potluck, and maybe welcome Virginia into our midst, how do we live in that spirit now? How do we live in the spirit of Abram as peacemaker, of Rachel and Leah as reconcilers, Jacob and Esau, Joseph? What does integrity demand of us today?